People are still trickling in, but I think it's probably time to get us started. So my name's Imogen and I coordinate the Right to Food programme at Sustain Alliance for Better Food and Farming. And today's session, we're going to be focusing on the right to food and human rights. And we're going to be hearing from an array of speakers from across the UK who'll be talking about why they've chosen to use human rights as a campaigning tool, but also the impact that human rights have had. So in terms of how it's going to work this session, we're going to hear from each of our speakers for 5 minutes, and then afterwards we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. If you want to put your questions in the Q&A box, which is distinct from the chat box, that means that we can definitely pick them up later on. That would be great. If not, I'll try and find them in the chat, but that's not as guaranteed. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's Brian Scott from the Glasgow Disability Alliance. And Brian, you're going to speak to us today about why does the Glasgow Disability Alliance use human rights approach to support the participation of disabled people in decision making. So over to you, Brian.
Thanks very much, Imogen. Hello, everyone. Glasgow Disability Alliance is a disabled persons organisation. So we are a member-led organisation of disabled people. We're the largest disabled persons organisation in the United Kingdom. And we support disabled people to share their lived experiences, to challenge the discrimination and inequality that is the day-to-day reality of disabled people's lives, and to support our members to work with power holders to make rights a reality on the ground. We use a human rights approach really to empower disabled people. Firstly, to know their rights, and I can't kind of overstate how difficult and challenging it is for people to access information on their rights. And I'm always quite surprised by, the barriers that are in place that prevent people from just having basic information about what their human rights are. So we support people to know their rights, but also, more importantly, how to claim their rights. So this is very much about holding to account those who have duties under equality legislation. Our human rights approach at GDA is guided by the panel principles, and apologies to people who are familiar with that concept, but panel stands for participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and legal rights. And it's a recommended approach to using human rights. And I wanted to focus very briefly on some aspects of the panel principles. The first one we mentioned here is participation, and it's so important. And for us, it's all about making sure that participation is accessible and inclusive. So that includes meeting an individual's communication and other support needs, and giving some thought to how, where and when it would be best for individuals to contribute their experiences and their solutions. So for Glasgow Disability Alliance, this includes providing assistance with transport, providing personal assistance for those who require it for their personal care needs, and meeting communication support needs in advance of any engagement, and also being flexible around the timings of engagement events and activities. In regard to the principle around empowerment, I think it's really important to emphasise that we feel that in using a human rights approach, meaningful participation can only really happen if you commit time and resources to building the capacity of individuals, and that may be done through briefings or preparation sessions or providing material or even individual coaching. And unless there is time and commitment and resources put into capacity building, organisations, we feel, run a real risk of tokenism, and you run the risk that any engagement around lived experience is just superficial. So in answer to the question about why we use a human rights approach to support participation of disabled people in decision making, I think the short answer is it can make a real difference to the outcomes and to the lives of disabled people. So just two maybe very quick examples of how we've used this approach in practice. As part of our COVID response, we've developed a lifeline support service of delivering food and shopping to disabled people across Glasgow who, for different reasons, were unable to access support from local community providers. And through developing that service, we were invited to support the development of the Glasgow City Food Plan, which is a plan to provide healthy, affordable food to everyone in an accessible way. So as a result of that, developing that emergency COVID response service, our members will now help to develop an accessibility guide for local community food service providers and partners that will hopefully encourage best practice around providing accessible services and support. Another brief example I wanted to mention, and I'm conscious of my time, is the All Our Rights in Law project, which I think Imogen's going to share the link to that. This was a project of community conversations to talk about a new human rights law in Scotland. And this project had 3 sessions with Glasgow Disability Alliance members, 2 with our Drivers for Change group, a group of members who are actively involved in our voice work and influencing policy, and 1 session with our LGBTI+ group. And these community conversation sessions really exemplified best practice in using the panel principles. They asked our members how and when would be the best place to have those conversations. They provided resources to support the sessions, including things like help with transport, and they did all they could to make sure the sessions were accessible. And a range of things were identified at these conversations around what is needed to make rights a reality, and the project identified and recorded, a whole range of things. And one of them was, won't surprise people, access to in-depth advice should be available to people when you have a rights problem. And the outcome of all that engagement work around All Our Rights in Law was it influenced the National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership in Scotland, and their recommendations, including that the UNCRPD be incorporated into new human rights legislation, is now being produced by the Scottish Parliament in the next session. So I think it's a very good example of where using a human rights approach can make a real difference to outcomes for people. So if you want to see more about what human rights means for disabled people, please have a look at our website. There's a really good film on our website, Our Rights 25 Years On, in which our members talk about what human rights means for them, what has been achieved since the Disability Discrimination Act 25 years ago, and what still needs to be done. I think that's maybe all I've got time to say at the moment. Obviously looking forward to taking any questions.
Thanks, Brian. That's great. Like we said, put any questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them later. And there's some links in the chat to find out more about Brian's work at the Glasgow Disability Alliance. So moving on, our next speaker is Jasbir Singh. So Jas is an associate professor at Coventry University Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, and you're also a trustee at Race on the Agenda. So Jas, you're going to speak to us today a bit about how the right to food can make a difference for people who are impacted by punitive immigration conditions. So over to you, Jas.
Thanks, Thank you, Imogen. I was going to give a bit of a broad brush introduction to the ideas and the kind of issues that are around immigration and the right to food. Okay, so it's kind of widely understood that food poverty is correlated with income shocks and changes in universal credit, how universal credit and work aren't meeting the demands of rising costs, and that's widely understood. And there's a range of other factors that I think are also part of the food poverty story around social, cultural, and environmental factors, gender, for example, that all contribute to food poverty in the UK. So food poverty for me is a very complex picture. A further example of that complex picture is that the policies aimed at raising income for work and universal credit will work for a lot of people, but however, for some migrants and people who seek asylum, they are denied access to work and access to public funds. Those kind of measures won't actually work, so we do need something different. And I think this is where the right to food could present a moment where we look at things differently. So just to give a bit of context to that, current immigration policies subject some migrants with an immigration rule that prevents access to public funds, termed no recourse to public funds. And he also denies some migrants and asylum seekers the right to work. And so in terms of public funds, for example, people who seek asylum and denied access to universal credit or other social security entitlements. The only provision available for people who seek asylum are mediated through Section 95 and Section 4 of the Immigration Act 1999, which is around £37.75p a week, which is well below the poverty line as cited by many scholars and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So it's well below what constitutes poverty in the country. Okay, so in relation to food and experiences of food, it's well documented that people subjected to the no recourse to public funds rules experience destitution, extreme poverty, food insecurity, including poor housing conditions. And that's quite important. So some of the housing conditions which are so poor also contribute to the food poverty in respect to inadequate cooking facilities. So in some, people who seek asylum are disproportionately receiving food bank parcels and other food relief projects. So there's a real clear link. Also, it's important to note that no recourse to public funds has disproportionately impacted on Black women and women of colour. So in other words, the policy is both racialized and gender in terms of outcomes. So historically, immigration policies were ostensibly racist and had race as a kind of technology of power to prevent people to settle in Britain. That kind of discourse is no longer part of immigration policies, but what kind of giving attention to the no recourse to public funds mechanism shows that has a disproportionate impact in gendered and racialized outcomes. Okay, so there's a clear picture between food poverty and experiences around destitution and no recourse to public funds. So I think the right to food approach could be used to leverage in extra funds, resources, and attention to examine more closely at the local level, at the local authority level, at the civil society level, what's actually happening in terms of numbers around no recourse to public funds and the lived experiences around that, because the research and the data and the kind of lived experiences are still quite marginal and not been fully integrated in the kind of discourses, ideas and discussions around food poverty. So for me, the right to food plays an important role in giving attention to this important issue. Okay, so as I said, historically, immigration policies have been linked to questions of race and belonging. And I think it's really important to kind of consider how the no recourse to public funds rule is very much linked to the hostile environment. And again, the right to food lens can pay a bit more attention on this subject, so on this issue around the hostile environment. So the hostile environment by Theresa May in around 22 was designed to be hostile and punitive. And the no recourse to public funds is an instrument in that hostility. It's led to the Windrush scandal, hardship, illegal detention, destitution, and food poverty and poverty per se. So it's really important that this kind of issue around immigration policy and the right to food are deeply connected, that we don't keep them separate. Okay, so change in immigration policy, and this is where I think the right to food and other imaginative approaches to social, cultural, and economic rights are required, because change in immigration policy is going to be extremely difficult given the contemporary anxieties around race and belonging in the UK. So perhaps the right to food, being universal, could importantly provide a legal and policy route to deal with growing food poverty in the UK generally, but more specifically, be a useful counterweight to the excesses of the immigration policy. The right to food could put a spotlight on government policies that clearly prevent people from feeding themselves in cultural and nutritious ways. So free school meal extension, including children from no recourse to public funds families, is a really positive development and shows the value of free school meals as a policy that undermined excessive immigration policies. So similarly, the right to food framework could allow us to examine a range of government policies, such as immigration policies, but others that undermine the right to food and provide legal ways to challenge those policies. How long do I have left? Is that enough?
30 seconds if you
30
really need it.
Okay, so in summary, immigration policies, especially the no recourse to public funds rule, creates negative outcomes which are both gendered and racialized, and then also shows there's a clear link between structural intersectional racism and food poverty. And the right to food can pay more attention to this and also examine existing immigration policies that are excessive in terms of creating disproportionality in poverty, food poverty. Thank you.
Thanks, Jazz. I think there's a lot to think about there, and I think there's a lot to discuss if we get a chance in the Q&A session later. So our next speaker, Alex, is joining us from Manchester City Football Club Food Bank, sorry, getting there, quite the title there. And so what you're going to talk to us about today is how through community organising, your food bank has developed a nationwide understanding and support for the right to food, and how this has even been translating in areas where you're not yet have a presence. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Imogen, and thanks for everyone else for your time. My name's Alex. I'm from the City Fans Food Bank Group. Just a really quick overview of who we are. We're a group of 5 City fans who started collecting for Manchester Central Food Bank outside games on New Year's Day 2020. Since the pandemic started, we've gone online and widened our focus, and now we collect for 20 and more food banks across Greater Manchester. We've raised 150 grand so far, as well as doing other bits like supplying PPE into social care and things like that. We've done this by working with United fans in Manchester and fans of other clubs across the UK in cities like Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle, Birmingham, London, and more. Football fans are the biggest organised group in every town and city across the UK. And as part of fans supporting food banks, we use that potential to help our communities. Now, while our local work with food banks in Manchester is our bread and butter, as part of the Fans Supporting Food Bank National Network, we've been working on the Right to Food campaign. I think everyone on this call will know there's no point in filling up food bank donation bins forever. That's a temporary solution, really, because food poverty is a symptom of a larger problem. Right to food is a start, it's a way into fixing that problem. So what makes football fans the right people to campaign in our communities? Frankly, we're naturally embedded in our communities at a grassroots level in a way that top-down campaigns aren't. We have a national reach. For instance, when Fans Supporting Food Banks started the national campaign against pay-per-view in the Premier League, we took action within hours. We turned it into a movement which raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for food banks, and we defeated the powers that be. It was the biggest victory for fan activism ever. And we're using that same methodology and ethos to push for a right to food in law by reaching out to groups we wouldn't normally have a reason to work together across the country and doing it that way. It's been going very well. So in cities and towns across the country, we've gathered support for right to food. To use Manchester as an example, our City and United fan groups organised a broad coalition from all sections of society to fight for a right to food. Football fans, renters unions, employment unions, the law centre, councillors, MPs, food banks, charities, schools and more all got on board. We held community meetings, we lobbied councils and got the Mayor's office involved. The result of this was that the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, so the Mayor's office and all 10 councils, including Tory-controlled Bolton, voted unanimously to make Greater Manchester the UK's first right to food region, demanding that this right was written into the National Food Strategy and then law. The meetings we held also created such a buzz that the second one included a visitor from Preston City Council who wanted to find out what was going on. Since then, we've stayed in touch, we've talked them through the whole process, and now Preston has passed its own right to food demand. They've also written to the National Food Strategy and law, again, including councillors from all parties. Similarly, we've held meetings with activists and councillors in Coventry and other cities who've seen what we've achieved and want to do the same. This is despite having no matchday presence for Fans Supporting Food Banks in cities like Preston and Coventry. But by organising in our communities, we've created something that goes a bit beyond them. And this has been repeated by other Fans Supporting Food Bank groups who have brought in support to cities like Portsmouth, York and Rotherham and others. And as a quick aside, within Manchester, building that coalition has had other pleasing consequences. So renters unions and the Law Centre have started working with Manchester Central and other food banks in the region to help their clients more directly, because the people who need food banks are the same people who need help with universal credit or legal justice or housing help and things like that. So hopefully Right to Food as a campaign, as a way in, can lead into other things as well. Nationally, these local grassroots campaigns have put an enormous amount of pressure on the government and Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy. Fans Supporting Food Bank, after all the councils came on board and started writing to them, Fans Supporting Food Banks was invited to give its own recommendations to the National Food Strategy. This includes universal free school meals, community kitchens, and much more. Pressure from football fans at community grassroots level led directly to this. And to keep that pressure up, we need as many towns and cities involved as possible. We need people like those listening to get in touch with your networks, to pressure local councils and MPs, get as many signatures as possible on our petition, which I believe Imogen's going to share. Our model for community organising works. It's not about football and it's not about food, but Right to Food is the way in for lots of other stuff. It's a way to go after larger problems which cause poverty in the first place. It's about solidarity and justice and dignity. Ourselves at City Fans Food Bank and the larger Fans Supporting Food Banks network, we will speak to anyone at any meeting. We have model council motions ready to go. We've got all the information you could want about how to build local community groups in your area and how to move it forward. We're available on email at mcfcfoodbank@gmail.com or on Twitter at mcfcfoodbank. Give us a shout. We've done a lot, and hopefully we can do a lot more. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say today. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Alex. I think there's a lot to say, and I think there'll be a lot to discuss later on. So let's hope this next introduction goes slightly better. I'm not very good with the acronyms, but Sarah Woolley is the General Secretary of the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, and they represent workers working throughout the food industry. And I believe, Sarah, you've been doing some really important research with your members around their experiences of food during COVID-19, experiences of working, but also food insecurity. Could you speak to a bit more about that, and also maybe why you've chosen to frame it with regards to the right to food and how important that was for your members?
Yeah, thanks, Imogen, and thank you for the opportunity to join you all and speak today. The Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union is the largest independent trade union to solely represent food workers throughout the food industry across the UK. Those workers who have been the forgotten key workers of the pandemic, working hard in the background to keep the nation fed. We're incredibly proud to be in full support of the work that Ian Byrne, the MP, has been doing to highlight the need to enshrine the right to food into UK law. And of course, the work Alex has just outlined with Fans Supporting Food Banks is inspirational. And Elaine Smith, the MSP that's recently retired up in Scotland, has also been doing some work up there that we've been supporting. As our members are the ones that feed the nation, it was only right that we speak to them about the situation they face and be their voice in both processes in England and in Scotland to make sure they're heard and to ensure that the wider public understand that whilst they may assume that workers in the food industry are protected from the difficulty in accessing affordable, healthy food, the reality is whilst our members in the food industry work day and night to ensure there's enough food produced for everyone else, they themselves can often struggle to access the food that they need. We know hunger in the UK is not a new problem, and their austerity policies have fuelled the rise of Food Bank Britain as living costs have soared, whilst pay has been cut, and the social security and safety net has been dismantled. The last 12 months dealing with the pandemic has brought into the public domain the hidden daily struggles of many people. And although we know the true scale of the issue is not definitively known, we do know that it is rising at an alarming rate, and more working people are reliant on food charities to feed themselves and their families. And this is why we need to enshrine the right to food into law. To make decent, nutritious food truly accessible, we need to make it affordable, healthy, safe to eat, and fairly produced by well-paid, unionised, protected staff throughout the food industry. Because long-term benefits of this could include improving educational attainment, physical and mental well-being, which in turn reduces costs associated with poor health and a decreasing in crime, meaning businesses have a happier, healthier workforce. Because some of the findings of our Right to Food survey are shocking. 40% of respondents have eaten less than they thought they could. they should have during the pandemic due to a lack of money. 19% told us that there had been a time during the pandemic where their household has actually run out of food due to a lack of money. Over 35% said they'd gone without enough food to make sure others in the household could be fed properly, and 1 in 5 relied on food from a friend or relative to provide meals. And even more reported they were concerned about running out of food. And these are the people who have worked throughout the pandemic feeding the nation. Yet our survey suggests that food insecurity is a significant issue for workers in our industry. Worrying about being able to feed yourself and your family should not be something anyone has to go through, let alone through a global pandemic where there's been more than enough to worry about. And the reports are based on experiences in the most part from staff who have not been working from home for the past year. They're from workers who are going out every day to ensure shelves can be stocked, fridges and our bellies can be filled. And workers who I feel, and I quote, that the pay is terrible everywhere in these roles, but be honest, it's not enough to cover the bills and food. It's just not good enough. I'm frightened for my job security, and it's hard to juggle work and homeschooling. It's taken its toll on me mentally. And the public doesn't seem to be aware how many people even now don't wear masks, don't distance, don't sanitize their hands, and our workers don't feel safe serving them. And there's so many more in the report. And I'll finish on this. Our report highlights the shameful truth of food poverty in the food industry. No one should go without food in the 6th richest country in the world, yet shamefully, too many food workers are struggling to earn enough to purchase the very food that they produce. The pandemic has shone a light on the real key workers in this country, not the bosses, the shareholders or the millionaires, the people on the front line. Those struggling to make ends meet whilst propping our country up through the toughest year any of us have ever experienced, and we can't allow them to be failed any longer. We can't sit back whilst people are struggling to survive. The time is right now for the right to food to be enshrined in law. We need it. We need decent, nutritious food to be truly accessible, affordable, healthy, safe to eat and fairly produced, as I've mentioned, by well-paid, unionised, protected staff throughout the food industry. We're now going to use this report, which you should have had a link to in the chat, to work through what changes need to be made within the food industry to ensure that no one producing, delivering or selling food is in a position where they can't feed themselves and their families. We know it will take some time, but we are determined to force that change alongside Ian and Alex and the other groups that have all spoken about today. And finally, a cheeky plug. If you're watching this, you work in the food industry and you're not in a trade union, get in touch with the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, because together we can force that change. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I think, yeah, you really highlighted some key points there where I do think that food workers definitely have been, very much the hidden key worker during this past pandemic. And I think without them and their sacrifices, we'd definitely be in a very tricky position. So our final speaker before we get to the Q&A session is Nicola Brown. So she's the founding coordinator of Act Now Northern Ireland and a fellow for Social Change Initiative Belfast. So Nicola, I think you're going to talk to us today about the practical ways that organisations can put and centre communities at the centre of change. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Imogen, and hi everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here amid so many amazing campaigners and activists around the right to food. My work has been in Belfast. I'm sitting in very wild and wet and windy Belfast today, working alongside communities around the right to housing, the right to mental health. And I took some time last year to think about kind of some of the lessons around that. I've worked in very traditional human rights organisations. I've worked in academia, and it's always struck me that it's really important when you're fighting for a change like the right to food. It's not only about that result, it's about how you get there. And it's so much is about, community facing work that puts communities in the front is so important, because no doubt as soon as that right is in law, it's going to be the battle to implement it and to get the decision makers to actually act in accordance with the law that you'll have won, or that right that you'll have won. And putting communities at the heart of that means that you have that infrastructure ready, all ready to go, to put pressure where it needs to go, to make sure that decision makers are held to account for their actions and for delivering on all your hard work. And I think I'm going to talk a bit about human rights, because I think the story we often tell about human rights focuses on laws and treaties and international mechanisms and things like that. But the actual alternative view of is that it's actually people on the ground and communities who are involved in struggle and campaigns like this that are actually the true authors of human rights. These people, when we struggle, when we campaign for something, when we imagine something like the right to food, and we think this is something we want put into the law, it's that activism that actually leads to these laws and treaties being encoded, at the UN level or at the international level. So, everyday people are really the authors of human rights and are the people that actually bring these things into being. And I think when we're thinking about, in terms of how organizations often do their work, very often, sometimes human rights organizations advocate on behalf of people and don't move along to kind of create space for people to have their own agency and speak to their own truths. We often don't value maybe grassroots knowledge enough. We don't place it at the center of change. And very often, sometimes in organizations, we don't think about how we can sustain our activism into the future so that we can make sure that we're there for the next stages of the work and of the battle. So I'll talk about those three things just really quickly. I mean, in terms of organizing for change, and I know a lot of you guys will know this, in terms of working with groups, often our first conversation isn't about rights. And I can see like the work that the Manchester City Football Club Food Bank had done, it's actually been about action. It's about showing people what you can do. It's about them. And people become involved for so many reasons, whether it's a personal reason, whether they don't want someone to be impacted like they have through lack of food or through poverty. These are the things that move people to get involved. And time and care is really important in terms of building that sustainable group of people who are going to work on this. Because especially people who are directly impacted by the issues that they're working on, have a series of things that become barriers in terms of how they can get involved. So they might have a benefits hearing, they might have an inquest. And I think it's so important for organizations to think about how they can help with those things, so that they can become involved and stay involved in the activism that you're working with them on. And I think also it's so important to challenge the narrative, because those who are impacted by poverty, by lack of food, by inequality, are not only impacted by that lack of material resource, but they often don't have control about the narrative that the stories that people tell about them, that they're unworthy, that they're undeserving, or that they have, that the reason they're in this position is through a fault of their own. And often what the framework of rights can do, as well as the human connection that you're getting involved in when you're bringing people together to talk about their rights and to campaign for their rights, it leads people to understand that these issues they faced individually are actually collective, and that the source of the problem is not within them, it's within a system that has disregarded their rights and their needs. And that's so powerful and important. And that's really that's really human rights put into practice. It's meant to be about liberation and emancipation and changing how people see themselves, not as someone who has done something wrong in life to land in this position, but as someone who has not had their rights met, and where decisions have been made by actual people that have put them in this situation. Really changes everything and really gives that sense of hope and motivation to make change. And I think the power of naming the problem, like the right to food, is also very powerful, but can also have a backlash. And I think we might know that phrase, that by you give a problem its name, you become the problem, because people who haven't seen that problem before still don't see the problem, but they see you making a fuss about it. So they think that you're the problem. And that can be really difficult when you're campaigning, that there can be a backlash. I worked a lot with people who were impacted by mental health and bereaved by suicide, and they always noticed that the government would let them in the door, to talk about their experiences and their bereavement. But once they started to campaign and ask for change of those services, the tone was very different. And those doors closed again because they were no longer engaging on the terms that government had laid out for them. They were demanding change. And that, for the government, that's not what they were there for. So they became a problem. So the reaction was really different then. So I think that's really important to highlight. And also developing the knowledge, people who are impacted by poverty, by disability, by inequality, know very well the barriers that they face, and also know very well the solutions that can be put in place. And that knowledge for me is like gold dust, is valuable as valuable, if not more so, than the PhDs and the professors and the very high currency words. This is knowledge that really needs to be put at the heart of change, and finding ways to kind of just bring that together, put it out there in a public way, get people to stand behind it is so important for campaigning, I think. And also just to end, how we do our work, because if we're thinking about the right to food, getting that change put into law, and then inevitably the campaigning after that to make sure that that's implemented properly, it's a long road, this stuff. It's always, and it can be really exhausting. I see you nodding. And it's so important to make sure that we build in a bit of joy and and enjoy the mischief a bit of our activism work, because activism can be really life enhancing, and it gives your feelings of connection or solidarity, all that stuff. It can be really hard to articulate, but you feel it. On the other side, a lot of it is mundane, and a lot of it is administration and meetings and notes. So it's really important to make sure that when we're making wins, like things like this festival are just a brilliant example of that we're coming together and we're building in celebration so that everyone's labour is recognised and valued, because we want our activists to stay in the field, and when we get tired, when we are exhausted, when we lose hope, it only plays to the interests of those who don't want us to succeed, who want us to fail in making change. So, it's so important for our causes as well as for ourselves to make sure that we are sustained and we can take breaks and have joy and, just revel in the fact of challenge, and how brilliant that is to be able to challenge and bring something into place that wasn't there before. So yeah, I'll just end there. And those are just some practical observations about, community-led human rights campaigns. But it's really very cool to be part of this amazing event. So thanks for having me, and any questions I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks. Well, you brought up so many really important issues, as have all the other panelists. I think there's definitely a lot to discuss. So one of the questions in the chat from Nick, he's asking about how to build and continue building support for the right to food, because he's saying that once people, hear about the idea and hear about the campaigning work, they fall in love with the idea, but so many people aren't hearing about it. And, and how can we really build that awareness within communities? So I don't know if Alex, maybe you want to touch in initially, but if you unmute yourself, then I can draw you into the conversation to the panelists.
Yeah, I won't go on too much on this one, because actually Nick is part of our little Manchester City fans group. So, but what I will say, just very quickly, I think it might be best answered by others on the call, is our day-to-day stuff is very much person to person. Our friends are in low places, and that's fine. But I've noticed on this call and listening into this call, there's all sorts of people from public policy, from food charities, all sorts of stuff like that. What we can only do so much. Our reach is limited. The biggest boost we've got are when, for instance, Andy Burnham put it in his mayoral re-election manifesto and things like that, for obvious reasons. We need people in policy and who do this at big charities and I've seen a few people saying they're from councils in the chat and things like that. We need you to pick up what we're doing and run with it. We, as football fans, it opens doors which otherwise wouldn't be open, because everyone wants to be friends with football fans, right? But when it gets to a certain point, our influence stops and it needs to be picked up by other people. We've seen how popular it is in the community. I think Nicola made a really good point. You don't want to make yourself seem like the problem. However, the response we've had is, as Nick says, once people hear about it, they want to be involved, but we can only take it so far, which is why it's great. We've got Ian Byrne working in Parliament, and we've got this petition, and we've got an ear on the National Food Strategy. However, it's not enough. The best things we've done are make contact with Preston and Coventry, because it gets the message out there. We need people on this call to get in touch and share the petition, email out to their networks, just pull everything you can, talk to your fellow councillors. If you're on councils, we've got a council motion. I can send you the GMCA report that went through and got voted through. We've got the stuff. We just need people to help us out, really, is what I would say. I'd be interested to hear what other thoughts other people on this panel have on that question.
Thanks. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that question. Maybe Brian, you could speak to the work around building awareness of rights amongst the disabled community and how it's now used as a campaigning tool. Maybe that could be.
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of things to kind of touch on. I think Mick made a really interesting point about how supporting people to build their kind of capacity to be involved in human rights work isn't itself empowering. And I think that was such an important point about people realizing that they are, the victims of inequality, and that they face structural barriers, and that it's not their fault, and it's that's incredibly empowering. But I think one thing I would say is, in terms of that kind of, how do we engage with the wider community out there, and how do we kind of build support and a shared commitment to something like the right to food? It's just a kind of a kind of plea, if you like, from disabled people's perspective, which is to remember communities of interest, because we tend to default to working around communities of place and looking at going to anchor organisations within communities, and that was certainly something that happened throughout the kind of COVID lockdown response. Was in communities responded so well and so creatively, and so flexibly. It was fantastic. But there are a lot of disabled people out there who are not connected to their local physical community and who have a shared identity as a community of interest. So I think it's just important to kind of put that out there, that when we're looking to kind of get support and broad range of support across a whole range of underrepresented groups and people who are affected by food poverty, that we remember to engage with people who are a community of interest, and that's best done through their kind of member-led type organisations and identity groups.
Thanks, Brian. I think just to move this conversation on a little bit, Nicola, one of the things you mentioned was around knowledge production, in particular whose knowledge and information and experiences are valued. And Jazz, I don't know if you'd want to bring in maybe some work that you've been doing around community-based knowledge production and how that maybe contrasts with some other forms of academic knowledge production, but in particular how it also allows for, a diversity and plurality of voices, and also, so over to you.
First, me or Nicola?
I think if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Yeah, I think why researching with people in participatory approaches is really important is that I think the lived experience of people on the margins really show what's missing in the kind of general. So, for example, a lot of the things are changing very, very quickly, but a lot of the discussions and kind of reports around food poverty, we're often linking it to low income and universal credit and some other income shocks and so on, which are really, really important. There's no doubt that that's really important. But what was missing, what was on the margin, was the lived experience of people who were experiencing no recourse to public funds, i.e. those subjected to immigration policies. And through that lived experience and through that kind of research that allowed those voices to come to the fore, what we're seeing is a situation of extreme human rights abuses in this country, and I think it's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. The numbers are really low for people who have no recourse to public funds. It's such a minority that those voices and those issues don't come across. And that lived experience is important because what's happening in the UK is there's so much racism and anti-immigrant sentiment that voice gets drowned out even further, and it becomes politically not important to focus on those kind of voices. And I think politically, that lived experience is kind of, I think, is very transformative. It's really showing how there's holes in the kind of rights discourse in the UK when it comes to things like no recourse to public funds. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that it's done in a co-produced way and done right at the margins as well. I think that's really important.
Thanks. And I think that sort of brings us on to more of a question around intersectionality and understanding how people can be impacted in different ways by an issue. So, for example, women might be disproportionately impacted by something, but also maybe disabled women might be doubly impacted in a way that's different again. Sarah, I don't know if your research with members of your union, if you found any particular groups that were more impacted in terms of food workers, and in particular I know there's quite a lot of issues within food workers. I've noticed some research in London around people, for example, who might be undocumented or might have NRPF and therefore don't have access to the welfare state. And when the restaurants were closed, were therefore excluded from all forms of support. So I'm not sure if that's something that you came across in your research or not.
Not expressively, no. What we didn't delve that far into it when we kind of first put the questions out. What we have experienced over the last 12 months is, though, certainly where we've seen massive breakouts of COVID cases in sites, is where there's been a diverse workforce. They have really struggled to survive on either 80% furlough or statutory sick pay, because they've not had the support of benefits and support systems that British nationals have, because they're not entitled to them anymore because of the changes that Jasper outlined earlier, which has meant that they've been open to employers saying, well, it's your fault that this breakout's happened in our workplace because you've continued to come to work. And people have jumped on that rather than actually saying to the employer, well, actually, if you paid them properly in the first place, they wouldn't be putting their lives at risk, you know, car sharing, having to live with households of people because they're trying to protect their families and still coming into work. So the survey itself hasn't really delved into that, but that's something that we're going to look at, you know, as part of the next stage of work, delving down into it even more. And things that we found that have come out of the last 12 months haven't necessarily come out of the survey, but just our experiences. So we do have a lot of part-time workers in the retail side of the food that may have been okay prior to the pandemic because they may have had a partner that worked full time, but if they've then been made redundant, they're now really struggling on a part-time contract and having to utilise food banks, and we've had conversations with employers around how we deal with that as well. So not specifically from the survey, but that's part of the work that we're going to do going forwards.
Yeah, and I think that in particular brings together some points around the intersections between, obviously, human rights falls between issues. So, you know, you've got someone's right to social security impacts on their right to food, someone's right to work, you know, if they're having their hours reduced or whatever it might be, is also impacting on their right to food, but maybe their right to housing as well. And that sort of leads on. So one of the questions from an anonymous attendee is, how is the Right to Food campaign being taken up in more affluent areas where food insecurity is hidden in pockets of deprivation? I know that's something you see quite a bit in London, where you'll have areas which have high levels of wealth, high incomes, but then you have significant areas of deprivation where you might have child poverty rates which are, you know, double the national average. So I don't know if Alex, if you got anything particularly you might want to say on that, just in terms of the Right to Food campaign, but obviously I know the panelists jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say generally the pandemic's made that a bit harder. Normally we could have been out and about a lot more, publicising it. I can only speak from the football fan perspective, but I think City and United fans both, we got fans up and down the spectrum really, as poor as it gets and as rich as you're ever going to find in Manchester. By publicising it through football, we can perhaps reach people which wouldn't normally be reached. A really good example is that we make a point of saying, so Manchester Central Food Bank has given out 5 times as many parcels a week, and they cover the area where City's fans are mainly based. The chances are that if you go to a City game, you'll have a connection through at the school gates or at work, or someone you've been on nodding terms with at the game for a decade. You'll know someone, or you'll be connected to someone who's received an emergency food parcel from Manchester Central Food Bank in the last year. That sort of message seems to work. We've also through the City fan groups, I think as well, like people again, they'll bump into people they wouldn't normally pass in their day-to-day life because they've got the shared interest of football. So we try and work that way around to reach people who wouldn't normally be reached through the thing we have in common, and then really just pushing it in their faces constantly. And it's worked quite well. You know, all, like I say, councils in all the areas of Manchester, from richest to poorest, have all voted it through. And we've had success. Pretty much everyone we've spoken to, really. It's I don't know. We're quite direct with it though, so maybe that's the key. I don't know. we just tend to tell people what's going on, what we're doing, what we want them to do with it, and people get on board. So yeah.
Great. I like that, being quite direct. I mean, you've got to be, it's an urgent issue.
Absolutely.
So just to finish us up, I'm going to ask all of the speakers if you could, one thing that people should take away from this session or should do or whatever it might be, but one thing, and you've got about 30 seconds to say it in. We'll go in reverse order just to mix it up. So Nicola, you're first. So it'll be the one thing you want people to take away.
The one thing is just really value what you're building. You know, all these different networks all coming together under the Right to Food, that will serve so well, whether, you know, whether win or lose the next battle, you can't just destroy that. And that just means that this campaign is going to be really successful. And yeah, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
Great. Sarah, you're next.
There's something that I could do. Not to be ashamed, because food poverty, people are ashamed. That's why they don't talk about it. It's not your fault. It's the system that's put you in that position. And we need to talk about it more to remove that stigma.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done around stigma and removing stigma of this, especially, you know, when it is government decision making that is causing the food insecurity. You shouldn't feel responsible if that's something you are experiencing. Right, I'm trying to remember my alphabet now. Alex, I think you're next.
Yeah, sure. I'd say probably the thing to leave on is that Right to Food is not just about food. It's a Trojan horse to go after everything from minimum wage to debt relief to legal justice to housing. I bear that in mind. And also I would say it's surprisingly easy if you want to get involved and start putting pressure on your local council to gather together renters unions and law centres and everyone else in your local area and just get on with it. Like I say, we'll come and talk to you. It's really easy. People like to do it. Just get in touch with them and start it.
And just on that, if you are trying to push through motions through the local council, don't forget that the Right to Food was in the Labour, Liberal Democrat, Co-op, SNP manifestos in the last general election. So that can be quite a useful tool. Jazz, I think you're next. Oops, sorry.
I think just recognising the Right to Food is an international struggle, and that I think is really important, that this is happening internationally, and that's really important. The other thing is the Right to Food has to be radical and radically inclusive, and make sure it gives attention to the things like no recourse to public funds, which are very marginal issues that I think need to be at the core of the Right to Food campaign.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, we've talked about food workers today, but we haven't talked necessarily about food production. So, you know, the farmers and, you know, the work that's being done globally, just so we can have food. So, Brian, you're going to finish us up. So what would be one thing for people to take away?
I think it would be that if people feel that they maybe want to do more in terms of engaging with disabled people, whether that's around, you know, to get their involvement in the campaigning side of it and to change policy and have a right to food, or whether it's about actually just making sure they're accessing community provision, I would just urge people to speak to disabled people themselves, and the best way to do that is to contact disabled people-led organisations. And there are gaps, and there's parts of the country where there aren't disabled people-led organisations, but most areas there'll be somewhere you can go to around that, and I would encourage people to do that.
Thanks, Brian. And now I'm going to hand over to Simon, Food Power Coordinator, who's got a few final words for us.
Only if you're done, Imogen.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Just because this is the final sort of formal session of the Food Power Festival, we just wanted to say a few thank yous as part of one of the sessions. So it is sort of thank you so much to everyone who's come to the sessions. Everyone is still so busy, but also zoomed out, and we then introduced 4 days of Zooms and other kinds of technology. So we're really grateful for people sharing and learning, which has been together, which has been the whole point of Food Power programme for the last 4 years, fundamentally. And thanks to everybody who's been patient around some of the Eventbrite glitches, and also have tried out the Wonder networking space as well, which has been good for those who've taken part, I think. We do need to give a special thank you to Cecily, my colleague Cecily Spelling, who has been our conference Suprema. who's organised so much for the festival behind the scenes, as well as running so many sessions herself. So thank you, Cecily. We'd like to thank all the speakers from all the different food poverty alliances, organisations, projects, partners, and people with lived experience from all over the UK who've contributed to the sessions. We've had our Food Power peer mentors and others chairing, facilitating, note-taking, doing the tech behind the scenes, so thank you to them. Special thanks to Katie, who's been illustrating today's session and illustrated our opening session on Monday, and those will be tweeted out and saved in other ways as well. Thank you, of course, to the National Lottery Community Fund, who are the primary funder of Food Power's work, but also thanks to all those other funders who've supported our network to do so much work over the last 4 years. We will be sending the inevitable feedback survey to you by tomorrow. We know it's a bit of a pain, but we really do want people's feedback on the experience. You know, this sort of 4-day online festival has been a bit of an experiment, and we'd really love to know what you thought about it and what you got out of it as well. And there will be a prize draw for one lucky person who responds to that survey. So please do take no more than 10 minutes to do that for us. Lots of people have been asking about recordings from the sessions. Those will be available from next week, so we will send an email out to all attendees, as well as featuring it in our forthcoming newsletters as well. So just be patient with us. We had almost 30 sessions this week, so it will take us a bit of time just to process all those recordings and get them up on the website. This is the last formal session, but there is one more session this evening at 6:30, which is our photo competition awards and a quiz starting at 6:30 till 8. Ben and Cecily will be comparing that, and it should be a great opportunity just to have a bit of casual conversation and a little bit of fun, as one of the speakers said, to try and sort of celebrate our network as well as share all the learning we've shared. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Simon. I think all that's left to do is for me to thank all the speakers for joining us today, and looking forward to keeping on working with everyone going forward. Thanks.
Thank you.